don't know what it's like where you are, but here in Connecticut, where I live, we had quite a horrible day weather-wise. It got up to 95 degrees, pretty damn hot. Not a good day to be walking the dog either. Little Joshua wasn't quite happy to be out. And we had quite a heavy rain, which soaked us pretty bad. A couple of trees came down in the neighborhood, too. So, at least here in this part of the U.S., it's a good day to stay indoors and watch a movie, or even better, listen to a show about movies, which is what we're here about. Later in the show, we're going to be visiting with Mike White, who's one of the best film critics in the business. You probably know him from the Projection Booth podcast and from the Cashiers de Cinemart website. He's been the author of several books. Great guy, too, so I'm very happy that he's joining us. In a minute or two, we're going to be joined by a fellow who's here on the PPRN channel. His name is Jim Dynamo. If you're around Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern, you should listen to his show. It's called The Bad Machine. I'll tell you more about the show later. But Jim's going to be joining me because he's... speak of the devil. Called The Bad Machine. I'll tell you more about the show later. Hello? But Jim's going to be joining Jim, you got to turn off your radio.
Hello?
Hello, Jim. You got to turn the radio off. I think you got to turn off Carmen too, for that matter, Peter.
Hello?
Hello, Jim.
Oh, let's see if I can boost my... All right. Can we hear me? Can we hear each other?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear a word, Phil.
You can't hear a word. Not one word at all.
I don't know if you can hear.
I can hear you. Can you hear me? That's...
Okay, I'm going to call in. I'm going to hang up. I'll call right back, see if we get a better line.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
Not a problem. Okay, so this is why don't do live broadcasts at home, kids. These things happen. That's why the professionals tape their stuff in advance. But Jim Dynamo, let's try this. Hey, Jim.
Hello.
Jim, hey, can you hear me now?
We still have the same audio phone. I'm going to call you on a different phone altogether, 917.
Okay, it doesn't matter what phone you
Sorry
call
about
me.
this.
Not a problem. Goodbye. This portion of the online movie show is brought to you by AT&T. Use AT&T and these problems will not happen. So. Yes, what can I say? It's technology. It's his fine, I'd say. Might as well get 2 tin cans and a wire and might as well have the same problem. So while we wait for Jim to pick up another phone, it was a pretty bad day here weather-wise, and hopefully it'll be a little cooler this week. I just, what can I say? Wasn't planning to talk about the weather because this isn't the weather show, it's the movie show, so I'm at a loss for words. But the reason we have Jim on the show is because he had... Okay, let's try this. Hello, Jim.
Okay, are we live now?
We're live now. Can you hear me?
Much better, much better.
Excellent.
Sorry about that technical issue.
Hey, that happened.
How are you, Phil?
I could complain, but nobody would listen. But what about yourself?
I'm going to have to ask you to say that again. Sorry.
That's okay. I'd say I could complain, but nobody would listen or care, so it doesn't really matter.
Well, I'll care. I'll at least pretend sympathy.
Okay. Well, Jim... Okay, we're off to a good start. Jim, we're asked you to be on the show because a couple of weeks ago you pointed a movie out to me called Anarchy USA, and it was made back in 1966. I'm curious, how did you find out about this rather obscure little movie?
Basically, I've actually read some books way back in my college era that had pointed to the very same communist infiltration of our social network, our government, what have you. And the John Birch video, the Anarchy in the USA, pretty much sums it all up in a video fashion rather than in a book fashion. And I found when I did locate it through a variety of sidebars and random searches, it pretty much summed up everything that I had read in a bunch of books that unfortunately I cannot remember the title of, and I did not keep after getting them from my college library type thing. And this was the only means to find the same information in the modern age that was not in a print format or in the old pamphlet formats that we used to see in the late 70s and early 80s.
Well, just for the clarification for people who are listening, I mean, not familiar, Anarchy USA is not really a video. It was a film. I think it wasn't theatrically distributed, but it went out to social groups and educational groups back in 1966. It was produced by an organization called the John Birch Society. And for the benefit of those who are not up to date on their history, Jim, what was the John Birch Society?
John Birch Society was, they basically were an anti-communist society. They don't declare themselves as such. They would say that they were not. They were more of an American individualist society or an American patriot type movement, where they were more interested in the application and the adherence to our original constitutional values. So more of a founding fathers type movement that ended up going head against the communist movement in this nation. And they came to loggerheads as they had two different ideologies to work against, and working against each other, basically. And it's pretty much how it just played out. So Birch is the remnant of the Cold War anti-communist movement. I think they are probably a Christian or a Judeo-Christian foundation where they are a biblical organization. They're not just a purely political type movement. And again, they would declare themselves more about what they stand for rather than what they stand against. So they wouldn't exactly call themselves an anti-communist movement, but that is essentially what they are.
Well, the interesting thing about the film Anarchy USA is that it highlighted the influence of the Communist Party, not just the U.S. Communist Party, but also the Soviet Communist Party, on the U.S. civil rights movement. And a lot of people might think, oh, well, that's not true. That's a racist thing to say. But actually, it is true. And it's kind of strange because a lot of school textbooks and documentaries on the civil rights movement make no mention at all of the influence of the communists on the civil rights movement from the 20s, the 60s.
It's all the way from the 20s right through to today, quite frankly. What they're talking about now, if you've noticed in just the last week or so, you have the Black Lives Movement, which is essentially the newest version of a central committee of the Negro Commission type thing, or a committee internationale for the Negroes. And these were communist movements that were created in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And essentially what they were doing was they were utilizing the black civil rights concept to promote ethno-Marxism, essentially. They were going to use the racial angle to use that as the wedge in the social fabric to push the communist view. And what I think a lot of the reasons that you don't see it in textbooks, you don't see it in documentary form, is the communists who, for example, that the Birch Society would come against, they would infiltrate the education systems and the media systems and the school book printing type things. And what they would do is eliminate any of this information from the public. It's very common to what we see in our modern media, where you'll watch something on an online video that were taken by the people who are eyewitnesses, and then whoever, a left spokesperson or a right spokesperson, will come right out there and tell you that you didn't see what you saw. And that's what has been going on back and forth with these two groups. And I'm pretty sure that's why more people are not aware of the communist influence or the communist infiltration of the civil rights movement in this nation.
What's interesting about Anarchy USA is that it details the similarities between what was going on in the civil rights movement up to the early 60s with the revolutions that took place in Mao's China, in Fidel Castro's Cuba, and in Algeria during their War of Independence. And basically starting from almost an intellectual elite and then bringing it down to a point where there's complete anarchy in the streets. And again, also going back to sort of a rewriting of history, that by the time Anarchy USA came out in 1966, we hadn't achieved a post-racial society. There was a lot of tumult going on, particularly in the inner cities, where not only were there, for lack of a better word, it was called white flight, but there was also a great deal of violence and arson going on, and many of the ones wonderful cities were really reduced to wreckage.
Well, personally, I don't think that Newark, New Jersey has ever recovered from the 64 and 65 riots. I don't think that Watts, Los Angeles has recovered from the riots. I think that there were riots also in Philadelphia at the same time. And these were flaming up. They would pop up exactly the way we're seeing the news now. One day it's Dallas, the next day it's Baton Rouge, 5 days later it's Orlando, or 5 days prior it's Orlando. So what we saw then, 50 years ago and 70 years ago, we're seeing now. And again, the modern audience doesn't really have a context for what occurred when their grandparents were teenagers. And they don't know what went on when their parents were in their single digits. And there is no real media element out there now that would promote this information. And again, the systems that were put in place, and if you listen to or read the John Birch Society's material, they point out the systematic media manipulation and the systematic strategy used against the anti-communists or anyone who would stand in the communist agenda's way of getting their way.
Well, I also have to make...
what you see...
I'm sorry. I also have to make clear, too, with the film is not an espousal of racism. The movie does acknowledge that there were very significant socioeconomic problems in the United States, but the thing was that this problem was exploited quite cynically by the communists. And a lot of people don't realize it even went back to Stalin's government giving the okay to fester separatist movements in major metropolitan areas in the American South.
Oh, well, of course, the South, what they called the Black Belt. The very same thing that you hear Louis Farrakhan talk about now, or I meant to get in a moment ago. A week ago, Black Lives Matters said the same thing, where they wanted their own segment of the United States, or they want a state of their own, that they could build their own nation for exclusively blacks and what have you. And this is identical to the Black Belt concept and the Black Belt, or the Marxist-Leninist, or I should even say the Stalinist attempt to push this communist movement in the United States, again, using a segment of the population because they were socioeconomically deprived. They had the lower education, and these have always been traditionally the fighting forces for communist revolution, again, whether it's Algeria or Russia itself during the communist revolution, or where we see these things again. I'm losing my train of thought here for a second.
That's okay. Well, one thing about
what we've seen systematically across the whether it's China or the European communist satellite states, Russia itself, Cuba, Algeria, these places, it's the same pattern. You have a small group of intellectual elitists who stir up and inflame the working class or the class that feels it's deprived, and through that element they push it's racist that you're not doing this for me, so they're pushing a change that is racist in design, hidden all the while that it's more of a equal rights movement, and it's not really an equal rights movement at all. It's playing on fears, it's playing on guilt, and the usual nonsense that we've seen for, at this point, 100 years.
One thing about Anarchy USA, which I thought was a bit odd, though, there were several very prominent African-American communists who in some ways did more harm than good for the movement that were not cited, most obviously being Paul Robeson. W.B. Du Bois was actually an avowed Marxist, and he left the U.S. to move to Ghana, and they weren't in the film. Also, Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington, was communist, and they basically did not publicize his role back in '63 because his obvious political ties. And it's interesting because, I mean, I have more than a working knowledge of American history, and I'm aware of the history of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's a shame, though, that a film like this is somewhat marginalized today, and people are thinking, well,